remember early on when New York was devising the storage rules, it was the storage community that came to us and said, hey, we're different. And that's really an important part of the process. So I would encourage folks, to the extent that you have experience and you can share that information with the ISOs, they definitely want it and need it because they're not out there operating these kinds of assets all the time. There's not a lot of experience there yet for storage.
This is EnergyCast, and I'm Jay Downhauer. Today we're talking about three markets for energy storage and their approaches to balancing reliability for the grid and marketability for the developers who make these investments. These three regions are managed by ISOs, independent system operators. Unlike vertically integrated markets, where a single utility operates the generation, transmission, distribution, and sales in a region, an ISO is a wholesale market where these functions are decoupled. I've collectively used the term deregulated markets in the past, and that's not entirely accurate. There are regulations, particularly on the transmission side of things. But for the sake of this discussion today, these wholesale markets are working quickly to accommodate the business of energy storage. So how does the storage project make money? If you were depending on true market forces, you'd probably think of an energy market and what is often called arbitrage, or storing energy when wholesale markets are low and then discharging that energy on the grid when the prices are high. It's true, some storage companies can make a killing, especially when they can discharge their batteries during heat waves or punishing winter storms. But arbitrage is still a challenging way to pencil in an energy project. For one, huge energy spikes last an hour or two, not half the day most times. They're also random, and some markets, like one of my guests explains, simply don't have the spread in prices to make arbitrage worthwhile at the moment. That leads to two other mechanisms these markets have developed. The closest relative to arbitrage is a capacity market, where you pay a resource to be available in the future. This tool has been used for years to maintain resource adequacy on a wholesale market for traditional forms of energy generation, but for storage, this is in its infancy. And of the three ISOs represented on my panel, only one has a capacity market for storage at this time. That leaves the third market mechanism, what is collectively known as ancillary services. Now, this is a wide-ranging basket of functions that essentially helps maintain the reliability of the grid, especially as more renewable energy comes online. Examples include voltage regulation, frequency response, contingency reserves, and spinning reserves. ISOs like storage for these functions because most energy storage can ramp up quickly to match the variability of renewables. The challenge I discuss at length with my guests is how to balance these three: energy, capacity, and ancillary. The ISOs need ancillary services, but most developers also want to sell their power at the best price. So what happens if they stack arbitrage and ancillary services, for instance, only to not have enough power the next day when the ISO needed it? It's these ISO insights that I was proud to explore. My guests today are Cy Morty, Market Design Principal at ERCOT in Texas, Danny Johnson, Market Design Sector Manager for California ISO, and Mike DeSocio, Founder and CEO of Luminary Energy and former Market Design Director for New York ISO. Together they made up my panel on ISOs for the PowerGen International Show in New Orleans last January. I can't tell you how important it was to get these three guys together on the same stage. They make up the three most important and dynamic ISOs in the United States. You may have noticed that they were all market designers for energy storage, responsible for the policies that have made these three ISOs what they are. As someone who works in the energy storage sector and was chair of the Storage Steering Committee again this year, my experience pales in comparison to the knowledge these three brought to the stage. I had to do a lot of homework. I really appreciate the candor these three brought to the discussion. Energy storage is still in its infancy. If you look at the charts they provided in their presentations, which I've linked in the show notes, you'll see that storage only came online in a big way in 2021. And even these experts, who could fill an encyclopedia with their knowledge, will still admit they need energy storage developers to educate them. I hope you enjoy my panel with this ISO trio from PowerGen 24 in New Orleans. All right, everybody. Welcome to our panel on ISO Trio, the future of storage with America's three most dynamic grid operators. My name is Jay Downhauer, host of the Energy Cast podcast, now in its seventh year. Now, I've had a privilege to speak with a number of energy leaders in that time, but I've really leaned towards energy storage more than any other sector. I call it the energy industry within the energy industry. This year, I was proud to serve as chair for energy storage deployments, and one of the things our committee members wanted to emphasize was getting projects in the field. So future technologies are fun, yes, but we wanted to build this program for all the developers out there who are ready to build a project now. And how do we do that? Well, no project developer is going to get through a project without dealing with guys like these. And that's why I'm so honored to have three of the most prominent ISO, current and one former market designers in the country. In some cases, these guys wrote the rules for energy storage, and we are so thankful to have them today. They are Mike DeSocio, founder and CEO of Luminary Energy, formerly Director of Market Design for NISO, and Danny Johnson, Market Design Sector Manager for CAISO in California, and Cy Morty, Principal of Market Design for ERCOT. We're going to start with Mike. Tell us about what you're working on today and NISO.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Mike DeSocio. I worked at the New York ISO since it started up. It was a startup at one point back in 2000, and just left there in August to start up this new venture. At Luminary, what I'm doing is helping clients really navigate the changing landscape. There is a tremendous amount of change happening in the industry. As many of you know, a lot of that has to do with rules and regulations of participation. A lot of that has to do with navigating the new changes with interconnection and interconnection studies. My role at Luminary is really helping clients navigate wholesale and retail market issues in New York. I represent a whole bunch of different clients, mostly on the supply side and the developer side, and it's been quite an interesting 6 months so far. A little bit about New York. Currently, there's roughly 90 megawatts of storage online in New York, and roughly 60 megawatts of that is batteries. There's 20 megawatts of flywheels. The flywheels have been around since roughly 2009, so it's been almost 15 years or so now. And then 10 megawatts of what we refer to as non-markets. These are batteries or storage that are participating in utility programs. They're not really exposed to the wholesale market signals. They're really just plays to whether they're pilots or helping utilities deal with shifting load to alleviate a transformer overload or something like that. Now, in New York's load is roughly at peak in the 30 to 31,000 range on the hottest day. And with demand response, you kind of see that really getting clipped in the 30,000 megawatt range. Contrast that to what's in the queue for energy storage. There's 35,000 megawatts in the queue. So there's more megawatts of energy storage in the queue than there is currently load to serve, which is pretty interesting. But the future is pretty bright in New York. There's a lot of things happening. A lot of that has to do with the policies that New York passed a few years ago, the CLCPA. And so the CLCPA mandates 70% renewables by 2030. I think that will be a stretch, and there's more on that later. Currently, by rule, 3,000 megawatts of storage, although the governor has indicated, and we haven't seen it in policy yet, a willingness to go to 6,000. The studies show you need more like 15 to 20,000 megawatts of storage to get all the way there. And really what you're trying to do, what New York is, get clean power grid by 2040, which was pretty aspirational. There's a lot of change that has to happen between now and then. So when you think about where we are, New York's power system is still based on conventional natural gas power plants. These are somewhere between 8,000 and 14,000 heat rate units, and they're burning $2 and $3 gas. So you look at pricing in New York, you're looking at $40s to $100 on peak. You're not seeing real big swings in price day in and day out. And then last thing I want to mention is there's a lot of opportunity coming. With all the renewables coming, there's a need to balance that. Storage has a tremendous opportunity to do that. There's a storage credit that the state is considering to help make up the revenue gap that exists. And there's a lot of things happening with also trying to value the carbon component of what renewables are bringing. So how do you value that and actually make that something that you can make revenue on? So a cap and invest kind of program is something that New York is also thinking about. A lot more to talk about, and I'm going to hand it over to Danny right now.
Thank you, Mike. I'm Danny Johnson. I work for the California ISO and their market design group. I want to give a little bit of background on the CAISO before I talk about how storage is being implemented in our market. We have a peak load of about 52,000 megawatts. We operate day ahead and real-time markets for California and a real-time energy imbalance market for about 80% of the Western U.S. It's about 120,000 megawatts of load. I'm going to kind of focus the rest of my slides today on the CAISO portion of this from the Cal ISO BAA perspective. Right now, we have about 8,000 megawatts of storage resources installed on our grid. About 900 of these are using our hybrid resource model, which I'll talk about in the next slide. These are primarily 4-hour lithium-ion batteries. And then, as Mike alluded to earlier, the queue is really backing up with, for us, solar and storage. I think our latest cluster had 311 applications for over 115 gigawatts of installed capacity. Obviously, all of that will not be built, but to the extent a significant portion is, this will become an ever larger component of our resource mix. This is just a trend showing how storage is being deployed and growing as part of our resource mix. It's a fairly aggressive push. You can see in the last 3 years, maybe we've gone from almost no megawatts of storage on our system to right now about 8,000. We had about 6,200 megawatts of storage online, and now we have 8,000 megawatts 6 months later. We have 3 different ways storage resources can participate in our model right now. The main one would be our non-generator resource model. From an optimization standpoint, we simply allow the storage resource to bid up to its maximum charge and discharge. It's fully biddable. It can respond to any operating point within that range. We have 2 additional participation mechanisms. And this is really kind of an artifact, I think, of the queue situation where typically when these projects come online to get deliverability, upgrades are required or there's limited deliverability. So what we see developers often doing is pairing solar predominantly with storage resources such that they can utilize their deliverability through all 24 hours of the day. They're able to maximize their investment to connect to the grid. The hybrid model models these as a single resource. So the Cal ISO kind of optimizes the entire project and tries to revenue maximize for the market participant on the project. The second model is the co-located model. Here, we are modeling the different components of the project separately. The main driver on this model was to provide market participants a greater ability to control the utilization of their asset for primarily investment tax credit purposes. There were some rules and regulations previously that ITCs would go away if a resource charged off the grid. So this model is often used by market participants who want to make sure that those ITCs can be maintained. So that's how they participate. Now, how does the CAISO use them? Storage resources in our energy markets are purely arbitrage based. They are literally buying low, trying to sell high. They are eligible to receive energy awards, ancillary service or reliability service awards. So this would be regulation, contingency reserves, as well as awards for our flexibility products. We have a couple different products that pay capacity, essentially a capacity payment to be available to ramp and meet the needs of our grid. Now, our main tool within our optimizations to track this is what we call the state of charge parameter. This is how much energy is in the battery, or conversely, how much headroom does the storage resource have. This is optimized in our day ahead and real-time markets. The last point I want to note here, and I think we'll probably talk more about this, is we utilize a multi-interval optimization. So we're looking at a number of intervals into the future, and based off the bids to buy, to charge and discharge, we're able to optimally utilize both conventional and storage resources to minimize total system cost. And there's some really good perks for this with storage, but there are also some challenging trade-offs regarding settlements. This is a representation of the buy-sell spreads that we were seeing in our market last summer. So these would be the prices to either charge or discharge. You can see there's quite a bit of activity between $0 and $200. This would correspond to more typical system days where we have a significant amount of very low marginal cost production through solar and wind in the morning and middle of the day. That then gets bought for cheap, stored, and arbitraged later in the day at higher prices. The outliers of the really low prices and really high prices would be low prices in the spring when we have much more supply than we can feasibly use. And then the high prices are our scarcity conditions, which for us are peak summer. I wanted to touch on the additional policy work. We've done quite a lot in the last 3 years since we went from pretty much no megawatts to 8,000, but there are significant things that the grid operators are going to have to work through with this community on how these resources are utilized. The biggest is just state of charge management. It's finding finding the right balance of flexibility for asset owners to utilize and bid in their assets as they see fit, with also ensuring that as a grid operator, those assets will be able to perform as dispatched and we can maintain reliability. Next would be retaining an incentive-compatible dispatch within that construct of a multi-interval optimization, to the extent that you're making financially binding decisions on advisory intervals. To the extent the prices in the advisory intervals don't materialize, your incentives can get out of whack. So it's making sure that our forecasting is accurate and everybody's comfortable with the use of the multi-interval optimization. And then finally, the last big challenge that's out there is, how do you look at this in a forward capacity planning construct? We don't have a capacity market in the California ISO. We have a bunch of different jurisdictional entities that operate bilateral RA programs. But this problem is, I think, shared for everybody who's going to have a high VER penetration, storage penetration resource mix. The traditional stack analysis where you're seeing, can you add up all your capacity and meet peak load during that hottest hour, coldest time of the year? That goes out the window with storage, because you have to make sure that they have the ability to discharge the energy during those times. When are you charging them? How does this get factored into the capacity planning aspect of our industry? And that's something that we're working on and thinking through. That's the conclusion of my comments today. I wanted to turn it over to Sai before we get to questions.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Jay and Mike. I'll go on to the ERCOT side of the presentation. So we're all ISOs, ex-ISOs, and on the surface, it might appear that the functions are all kind of similar, how the rules are similar, but there are differences. So I'm assuming that most of the audience is developers. Folks who are developing for Cal ISO, when they come to ERCOT, there is a learning curve. So just be aware of that. In general, all the ISOs on a broad scale have the same functions. They want to run a market. They want to operate the grid reliably. But there are some nuances when it comes to the actual implementation. So just keep that in mind as you guys build in other places. In this presentation, I'm going to go over some of the ERCOT facts. We don't have a capacity market. We look at and say, hey, California at least has a resource adequacy requirement. We have nothing at present. But we are getting a lot of batteries. We are 80 plus gigawatts of load. We are an island. So our frequency response requirements are much more stringent for anyone installing resources on the supply side on the ERCOT grid. Today, we have 4,000 megawatts of batteries. What are they? Most of them are interconnected to the transmission systems, but we have a fair amount, about 500 megawatts of distribution system connected batteries that participate in the market. We have very tiny stuff, what we call a settlement only. They're kind of Mickey Mouse research projects done by City of Austin just to do a feasibility stuff. But otherwise, most of them, if anyone puts a battery on the ERCOT grid, whether it's on the transmission or distribution, they're out there to make money from the wholesale markets. We also have aggregated distributed energy resource, and this is a pilot that we're running that started off last year. It's interesting. These are resources on the distribution grid where an aggregator comes along, aggregates them, and they have to come up at least above 100 kilowatts to participate in our market. The interesting thing is, in this pilot, we have a couple of other ones, but Tesla is the main one. And what they've done is they have aggregated residential batteries and they're offering it up into the wholesale market. Now in ERCOT, all of the batteries, their primary revenue source is the ancillary service market. They don't do too much arbit. We have very large price volatility, but their bread and butter, if they want to see if the installation is economically viable over the long run, it's the ancillary service market that they target. Energy arbitrage is just gravy on top of it. So all the ISOs are seeing the same stuff, nothing. And in 2014, our CEO said, hey, what is the futuristic stuff that you need to be looking at? I propose batteries, and you don't have any batteries. Now we are chasing our thing here. It's increasing tremendously. This is the same thing on a monthly basis. One of the things in ERCOT is, since we don't have a resource adequacy construct, most of our batteries are 1 hour duration. And that makes a lot of operational challenges for us. So you will see that they have captured the ancillary service market, or they're on their way to capture all of the ancillary services. So what we may see is that if this ancillary service market gets saturated, the prices fall. If new batteries come in, they will be doing energy arbitrage. But now I don't see a big thing here. So this is really the challenge we are facing. That is, I look at a battery as, we might have a 100 megawatt battery and we have a 100 megawatt gas turbine. The way I would compare that is both are F-150 trucks. One of them has got a regular gas tank. the other one has got a half-gallon gas tank. How do you operate that? How does the grid operator plan for the next couple of days, right? So we have intraday issues that if suddenly we get a price spike in the afternoon and these guys drain all their energy, what do we do for the evening load pickup? Or if we get a big cold front coming in and it's cloudy for multiple days, the batteries can't charge because the prices are too high. What do we do? And remember, these are not small fractions of the supply side. These are going to become one of the major parts of the supply mix. So that's something that we're going to be working on. Thank you.
Thank you all. I'm just going to do one question for each of the panelists, and then we're going to open it up to all the folks out here to ask questions. We'll start with Sai. You mentioned that most of the storage in ERCOT is short duration, 1 hour. So what do you think will create the greatest incentive for developers to build longer duration storage, which I think you're probably going to end up needing, right?
Yeah, that's what the ISO would like to have. From the developer's perspective, they'll say, hey, will I make money with my capital investment? And the primary thing that they'll look at is the price duration curve. We have good scarcity pricing. Our price caps are really high, but do they last long enough to justify the capital investment in extra storage? I think if we start seeing longer duration price scarcity intervals, that might incentivize. Nowadays, we're getting some 2-hour batteries, but the real thing that we need is a capacity construct where there's a capacity payment, like a capacity market. Lack of that, I think we're just going to have to wait.
Danny, you mentioned the 3 market models, non-generator, hybrid, co-located. What are you seeing most developers leaning towards, and why do you think maybe one model is used over the other?
Most developers have landed on the NGR model. That's the standalone resource. I think it's really hard to differentiate between that and the co-located model, since effectively they're multiple projects behind the same point of interconnection.
Thank you. Mike, I'm interested in this new venture you're doing after a long career at NISO. What can you tell us about potential clients of yours as it relates to what we're talking about today? They want to develop in New York. What do you see? What are you telling them in terms of opportunities focus on storage?
Yeah, certainly. New York is in a really strange place right now where the policies have moved New York towards electrification goals, where load is outpacing new resources. When you look at storage plays, New York does have a short-term or spot capacity market, and those prices look robust over the next 5+ years out. My estimates right now are out to 2033, where expect robust capacity prices in Southeast New York. New York City is dangerously close to not having enough supply to meet reliability standards. The state is about 3 or 4 years away from not having enough supply just to meet load on a 1 in 10 basis. So there is a whole lot of pressure to get new resources built. The opportunity for storage is kind of twofold. Maximize wholesale revenues, which really means in New York, capacity and ancillary services, because the New York energy price does not have enough arbitrage opportunity in it. There's maybe a $15 to $20 spread throughout a day. It's just not enough to really pencil out on energy revenue. But there is opportunity in ancillary services. The ISO is doing a lot of work there. So by the time you get a project developed, expect ancillary service requirements to almost double is my expectation. So you're talking 2030, doubling some of the requirements. Capacity revenues are good. And then you're looking for an off-taker. So at the end of the day, you've got either a utility or a large commercial company that is looking for some way to build some resilience in their facility. There's a lot of incentives out there for storage. I think the downside right now is there's some open policies that need to be dealt with in Manhattan specific with fire codes and things like that. But I would expect that'll get handled in the next year or so. Where we're kind of focused is avoiding the retail market because of the cost issues, particularly on the charge side. The battery is being treated like native load, which means you're paying for all the demand charges like any other building. That makes it really hard to pencil out, and just focus on getting that off-taker agreement and then wholesale market revenues if you can.
I want to see if anyone has any questions, and I'd like to see if we can do questions for all three. Right there.
I'm wondering if you're starting to see developers take advantage of 30% tax credit, the IRA tax credit.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I don't know if there's been a huge material impact in our queue because it's already stuffed full of storage projects. I think our biggest change is asset owners may make them more able for the CAISO to use to manage reliability. We'll be able to use them to be an energy off-taker rather than that off-grid charging limitation that was previously there under the previous tax credit schemes.
Yeah. And Texas doesn't have any state subsidies. So when you see a huge queue for a particular technology, you can directly trace that back to some federal subsidy, like the Inflation Reduction Act in Texas.
And likewise, New York. The reason the queue is the way it is because of the change in IRA. Originally, you'd see much more co-located resources. You still see some of that because of the need for cheap energy to charge the battery. You still see some more sophisticated developers focused on co-located, but generally it's standalone and they're really leveraging the federal tax credits and they're being opportunistic about the state actually producing a storage incentive directly. So NYSERDA in New York is considering a direct subsidy, kind of like a REC, but for storage. It would act like a CFD, and we could talk a little bit more about that. But there's a lot of things happening. It's just a matter of how quickly the policies actually unravel and come to light. It's still in the formation and discussion mode. Nothing's been put in print yet.
Yep. Over here, I'm Hardy from Mitsubishi Power. And, this is great. Like, we have 3 major ISOs over here. Specifically, ISO is one of our biggest clients. We are developing the hydrogen project and build up for them. Question go on 3 of you is, given the issues you're seeing with short duration storage, lithium-ion batteries, which basically are designed to do daily arbitrage, have you investigated long duration storage technologies like hydrogen and the value that they bring?
ERCOT answer is simple. We don't have a reliability standard yet. We have a target reserve margin. So the answer is we haven't done any studies on that yet.
So CAISO operates the grid it's given. So we have a number of different jurisdictional entities who make their resources available that were contracted under whatever those jurisdictional entity rules are. And then we operate the grid for a few days out. We've been working a lot with some of the other agencies in the state of California, examining what is the value proposition of long duration energy storage. Intuitively, it seems like it would be important in a resource mix. It's a little bit harder to quantify in terms of the daily production and consumption of energy that the ISO's bread and butter is right now, operating a daily energy market. I'm not sure in the energy sense what the market would be compensating for that other resources aren't offering. I think more of the RA, resource adequacy, IRP, forward planning sphere is where we may see the LDES business case and value proposition become apparent.
I would share the sentiments here, but I would say in New York, there's a bit more happening. New York has a capacity market. They introduced in the last couple of years what is referred to as capacity accreditation. Capacity accreditation for storage is really thinking through the value of various durations of storage. There is a mechanism now to value, say, 4 or 6 or 8 hour storage much higher than, say, a 2 or 1 hour battery. At the same time, you've also got other reliability standards that New York needs to comply with. So you've got the RA issue, which capacity accreditation will help with. But recently, a lot of the issues have to do with managing transmission constraints or transmission security. New York put out a report last summer that suggested it was going to be short energy by 2025, which meant it had to retain roughly 450 megawatts of really old, 60 to 70-year-old gas turbines to manage a 9-hour transmission security issue. And as you look and watch the planning studies move out in future, it is apparent that these transmission constraints and transmission security issues are going to become larger and larger. So you see the ISO now thinking about how do I get a market signal out there for transmission security, which I totally expect will be focused on longer duration assets. That's what the ISO is doing. Separately, on the policy side, the state hasn't been very clear about what kind of resources actually are treated or will be treated as clean. And so hydrogen is now part of that conversation. There is a proceeding going on referred to as the zero emissions proceeding, which is really trying to focus on what are the technologies out there that we should be counting on to meet a zero emission standard in 2040. There's conversations about SMBs and longer duration storage like iron batteries and hydrogen and all sorts of things. Hydrogen is a very big part of that conversation. And the way I see it playing out is New York is so reliant on natural gas that you're going to end up in the long term with a natural gas play and maybe a hydrogen option, or a natural gas play that's got a battery option. And it seems to be those types of things that are going on where you can leverage the the interconnection of the generator for, say, a battery asset while you're continuing to have natural gas available so that if you do have a reliability event, you can actually keep the lights on. Or you have this play on fuel side, which is I'll go in natural gas with an option to go hydrogen, is assuming that the hydrogen is available at the time. And to me, that play is still a little bit further out. I don't know that I'll see that in the next 10 or 15 years. It seems like it's going to take a while for the power sector to get hydrogen to be cheap enough to make it worthwhile making electricity. Just my view on it, but there's a lot happening.
Before we had this panel, we were discussing the challenges of state of charge, particularly when it comes to participants who want to, say, provide ancillary services and then participate on the capacity side. You want them to participate. You need the resources. They may not have it at the time. How do you set it up where you don't want to penalize them to death? How would you overcome the challenge like that?
So we have a number of different tools in our toolkit that we try to use to manage state of charge, and it really is the primary operational concern that we're trying to work through right now. We operate sequential day-ahead and real-time markets, so we schedule across the 24 hours in the day ahead, and storage resources will receive an ancillary service award, right? The question is, how much of that award gets converted into state of charge? If you get a 10 megawatt award for regulation down, is 5 megawatts getting converted into state of charge when you're charging? Are you assuming 7 megawatts is? Are you assuming 2 megawatts are? Depending on what that assumption is, that then can dictate what the market schedules and financial positions these resources are taking later in the day are, because that state of charge does get converted to energy and is arbitraged off. And then the real trick is when you get into the real-time market, was that accurate? Because if it's not accurate, you're not going to have the state of charge there when you need it for your reliability services. So we have some additional constraints in the real-time market that try to force some level of state of charge. But to us right now, it's really working with our market participants to figure out how we accurately capture that state of charge in the day-ahead dispatch such that when we get into the real-time, they can just repeat their day-ahead offers and be in a financially sound position and aren't left holding infeasible financial schedules from their perspective and then leaving the ISO in a reliability challenged situation where we don't have the ancillary services that we thought we procured.
In ERCOT, we're playing catch-up right now. We don't have a real-time energy and ancillary service co-optimization market. We are getting there. And so we'll be looking at New York ISO and Cal ISO and learn from them to see what kind of rules or constraints we need to put on our clearing engines to do that. But it is an issue. And one of the challenges we will have, or we have right now, is when we start imposing any kind of state of charge requirements, there is a question of, is this discriminatory in the sense that we don't have similar stuff for thermal resources. But like, again, the example I gave before, a thermal resource are obligated to inform us if they have any pipeline issues. And generally, it's a slow process. We have at least a day or two. Whereas for a battery, which is 1 hour duration, we don't have time to react. So that's the challenge we're facing. And we're trying to muddle.
Yeah, the challenges that are out there, I would echo. The way I look at the state of charge when I talk to developers has to do with whose forecast do you trust the most. And if you feel like as a developer, your forecast is really good, I'd advise you not to use the state of charge management that the ISOs have. The reason for that is when you think about day ahead and then their state of charge management, if the day ahead that the ISO prepared, the forecast doesn't match what's going to happen in real time, that state of charge constraint is pretty much useless. And the same thing can happen in real time where you end up with a constraint that is suggesting that you should hold back the battery because 2 hours from now I expect the price to go up and therefore I should charge then. But when I hold it back, it turns out that other things transpired where the forecast the ISO had 2 hours out wasn't that good. And so it really just comes down to, do you feel like you have a better view of the future, or do you think the ISO has that better view? And that's really how you need to think through using the state of charge tools. Then there's the question about how good are the state of charge tools. And I would say that all the ISOs have work to do, including New York, because there are linear constraints. We know battery discharge is not linear. There's a lot of things that need to be captured that are not captured. And the ISOs are rightly afraid to go too far with these constraints because it becomes how much of the asset are they controlling versus letting the market just decide how they want the asset used. And then there's a solution space issue where you add all these constraints to a real-time market or day-ahead market, and now you get into questions about can you clear it in time to meet a 5-minute target or meet a 3-hour day-ahead target or something like that. So a lot of things need to unwind, but ultimately it comes down to if you feel like you have a better view of the future, I'd advise you just to bid as an asset that knows when you want to deploy energy and when you don't, and take it that way versus having the ISO manage the energy of the battery.
Wanted to talk about the differences between you guys. Sai, we spoke about how ERCOT is a little bit more free market in the sense that, hey, you can make a killing, but they're not going to cover your risk with incentives. And Mike and Danny, your markets have a little bit more financial protection, more financial incentives. So what is the correct answer there?
I'm going to jump in. It really has to do with fundamentals and behavior, right? Behavioral economics. That's really what we're talking about with these markets. I'm going to talk a little bit on Sai's behalf, and then I'll contrast that to New York. In ERCOT's market, the price signal is incenting an operational behavior. And then it becomes a question about how much information is out there to feel like you can build an investment case based on those volatile prices. But from an operational standpoint, that market design is very, very good. From a revenue standpoint for developers, it's very risky. When you contrast that to New York ISO is a capacity market. The purpose of the capacity market is to take the volatility out and smooth it out, which is great for revenues, but not super great for operational certainty, where you're providing very, very strong signals that I want you off the grid because it's a really bad day, or it's a really light day and I want you to consume as much as possible. So I have really negative prices and really positive prices. New York, you're not going to see that volatility like you do in ERCOT. So there's pluses and minuses of both, but from penciling out a project, the certainty in a capacity market brings makes it easier to go to a bank. And for those of you that develop, I think many of you know that. The only thing better than that is having a long-term guaranteed contract, which I think everybody wants these days.
Yeah. I don't think I have to answer. Mike answered for me.
Mike's got it covered.
The only thing I would add is that after Storm Uri, the legislature asked us to look at something called performance credit mechanism. It's a capacity construct where resources are paid based on their behavior in the past year. So we'll see where that goes.
And I'm just not sure there is a right or a wrong model. I think it's all going to be dependent upon the political landscape of which you're trying to develop your project regarding which of the two models they elect to implement, be it the kind of capacity energy combo or the energy only market.
Danny, I've worked in California, and we hear all the time about you got so much renewables on the system, and Cal ISO's talked about the curtailments, and I know you're trying to address that. So it seems like storage in California is playing catch up to renewables. And Mike, I think you've got so much storage that's on deck, you're waiting for renewables. So it's kind of an opposite situation there. And I think ERCOT's kind of waiting to see which way it's going to blow.
Yeah, I'd say that's characterized right. And it really gets back to what are the operational challenges we're facing. We have all of this solar, the sun goes down, and we have about 15,000 megawatts of behind-the-meter rooftop solar, as well as about 20,000 megawatts of grid-connected solar. All of that disappears at the same time, and the behind-the-meter solar ends up getting reflected and the load's not really falling off. And so our operational challenge isn't so much meeting 6 p.m. at the end of August, our all-time peak. It's 3 hours after that. And so we have this huge solar build-out. We have very, very low prices in the mid-morning through early afternoon, and we're able to just move that energy to when we need it via the existing storage fleet.
Yeah, and New York is not there yet. So New York's got roughly 5,000 megawatts of solar. 95% of that is behind the meter. And so what that leads to is in shoulder seasons, you'll see a little bit of a belly in the middle of the day. But during peak winter, peak summer, it kind of just flattens out in the day. You don't see much of a belly. And then New York also has roughly 2,500 megawatts of land-based wind. So there's just not a lot of low marginal cost assets moving the price to a point where you're looking to do an energy arbitrage play in New York. Storage in New York is looking to do an ancillary service play with a capacity market option. And maybe they're doing that with the hopes that in 5 years or so, when more of the offshore wind is actually available and built, you'll end up with a bit more of a belly and a little more of a diurnal change in price from midday to later in the day, where you can get paid on both sides of the equation, both charging and discharging. But we're not there yet. And there's a lot of renewables need to get built first.
Anybody have any questions?
Yes, you touched on the fire code issues. I'm just curious, from the three of you, are you seeing jurisdiction limiting you guys in dense populated areas or anything like that?
In ERCOT, that'll be purely local. Texas is very easy to build. I don't think we have that many regulations as in other jurisdictions.
Yeah, Manhattan is going to be a problem. FDNY is definitely not ready yet.
Go ahead. More requirements for ancillary surge.
Are you thinking more ancillary services or just ability to have flexible capacity and respond to variable energy output? Ancillary services are what they are. A resource has to qualify under our rules. We have explicit capacity products, which I mentioned earlier in the Cal ISO, that we actually forecast where the uncertainty is within all the different forecast bands for variable energy resources, and we will procure unloaded, deliverable, flexible capacity to be able to respond if that uncertainty materializes. And then on the settlement side, we go back and we build the resources that are creating the uncertainty in the first place through their operational characteristics. So our initial prerogative would be to do this through designing products that fill needs and price disciplining the resources to perform how we need them.
In ERCOT, when we design ancillary service products, it's technology agnostic. We said this is what the grid needs, and any resource, whether it's on the demand side or the supply side, if they qualify to provide that, they can provide it. So wind can provide it. In ERCOT, wind can provide any of the ancillary services if they qualify. But the economic challenge is, if I'm taking wind as an example, they get PTCs, production tax credits. They have a trade-off to say that if I want to provide an ancillary service, that means I need to back down. I'm losing PTCs. So they have to kind of play that game and see which one is coming out better. In terms of grid code, ERCOT made a mistake. Early on, wind was in its infancy. We didn't have too many reactive power requirements, okay, like other supply-side generation resources. And then when we played catch-up and said, hey, you need to provide the same kind of reactive support that the thermals provide, then we ran into this grandfathering issue because it was too expensive to retrofit. So if you're talking about grid code, I would say look at those kind of stuff and make it uniform, make it technology agnostic. Doesn't matter what kind, because we have no idea what kind of technologies will come in the future. See what the grid requires and make sure that it's the same for all types of resources. Now, the challenges we are facing today is on inverter-based resources. We are losing inertia, we are losing system strength, short circuit ratio. So right now we're thinking of trying to impose a grid code saying that you have to be in a grid forming inverter. But that's new technology, right? So those are the kind of places where we say you might want to change the grid code. But in terms of AS products, you design what it is and make it technology agnostic. If any resource can qualify, let them provide that.
And then issue about energy markets versus capacity market. I want to hear your views. How are you comparing as you keep adding all this renewables? What are you dispatching?
Yeah. How you going to dispatch it? You got all those renewables online.
So I hear this a lot, and I'll just share that future is not a future I think will ever happen for several reasons. The first of which is I don't see a grid that can be operated with just wind, solar, and batteries. And you're hypothesizing that the only thing on the grid are those kinds of assets. I also think that we forget a really key component to marginal pricing, which is opportunity cost. Opportunity cost has become a much bigger component of the price going forward, because you're talking about making a decision now versus later in all of these types of assets. Whereas today's market is, I made a decision to buy the fuel, I'm going to now burn the fuel. So my opportunity cost is pretty small. I don't see a world where you end up with just days and weeks of zero marginal pricing outcomes. I also see that in a co-optimized market, I know Sai is working on that in ERCOT. You got to remember the trade-off of shortage pricing in an ancillary service market and how that affects the energy price. So in that world too, to the extent you don't have enough assets to back up the loss of the wind, you now have a shortage condition that's going to lead to an energy price that's much higher than you would have seen otherwise. So there's a lot of pieces that we may get there, but I don't think I'm going to see it in my lifetime.
But aren't you probably going to meet your decarbonization goals and they go absent carbon?
Well, you're arguing now, right now, the reason we're moving ahead with all of this is because there is a whole lot of out-of-market subsidies to prop up the industry, whether that be federal contracts and grants, whether that be state subsidies. Pick your contract, or a utility being told that they got to go buy something. When you look at the fundamentals of penciling this stuff out, it's not economic yet. So I still have the view that we can't subsidize this forever. That cash will go away at some point. And at that point, these markets will be the only thing left to keep these assets around. And the price will be meaningful again.
All of you have been in the capacity of being where the rubber hits the road with storage. I think some of you have talked about how you've developed rules. So this might be a little bit of a silly question, but do you get approached by a lot of developers asking for certain carve-outs.
I think you just described our stakeholder process. We have an open stakeholder process in Cal ISO. Anybody can come and participate. Anybody can share their view. And the policy making is really like figuring out what are the objectives, what are the principles you're going to stand by, and then how do you make that work with that diverse set of market participants who all have their own commercial aims for where the policy lands.
Yeah, and same thing in ERCOT, the stakeholder process, anyone can come up with an idea if they want to carve out. It has to be voted on. So I think there is some balancing that happens.
I don't think the question's silly at all. And I remember early on when New York was devising the storage rules and I was working at the ISO, we tend to get sometimes a little myopic about how we view the dispatch world. And we've got 50 plus years of dispatching conventional generators. We understand how to do that. So we kind of view the world in that lens. And it was the storage community that came to us and said, hey, we're different. And they would spend time and explain why. And that's really an important part of the process. So I would encourage folks, to the extent that you have experience and you can share that information with the ISOs, they definitely want it and need it because they're not out there operating these kinds of assets all the time. You see in Europe, we got 90 megawatts. There's not a lot of experience there yet for storage.
Getting toward the end of this, as succinctly as the three of you can say it, you're operating in three very different states. If you had the legislature's ear, which I assume you do, what would you recommend for as healthy a storage market as possible for the most robust development?
You want to go?
I'm trying to think.
I am a free markets proponent, so I'm saying that I don't want to have any kind of state mandate or anything. It's free for all. If you think you can make money, come on in. We just have to make sure that the rules are non-discriminatory. And some of the rules I've written, some of the battery developers are saying are discriminatory because we are trying to manage the state of charge. And that's fuel. And they're saying, are you asking the same thing with the thermal resources? And like what Mike was saying, we don't have experience with batteries. They've come exponentially fast. And if developers can come and talk to us and say, this is how we operate, that will help us.
I would give them two forms of advice. I would tell them, let's move forward with the storage credit, but let's be thoughtful about how long we do that. So have a time bound. Maybe it's a 5-year incentive to really get the market going. Because as much as we talk about the ISOs need experience, the utilities need experience. There's a lot of layers in getting a lot of batteries developed and deployed in a market. And then the other thing I would say is, to the extent you are moving towards a cost of carbon construct, whether that be cap and trade or some other way, let's do that in the most holistic way you can, because ultimately that is going to change behavior far broader than any of these one-off incentives to a particular asset class. So those would be the two things I would say.
I think I'd kind of almost summarize what both Mike and Sai said. The support to be technology agnostic in meeting the policy goals that they're setting.
That gets us to the end of time. I really want to thank all of my panelists here. Mike, Sai, Danny, thank you so much for coming out, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was Sai Morty, Danny Johnson, and Mike DeSocio, panelists from my ISO Trio panel at PowerGen International earlier this year. I want to thank the three of them for their time, as well as Gabby Cesare and Kevin Clark from PowerGen, who always support our efforts to make the show the best it can be. You can find plenty of pictures for this episode on energy-cast.com, as well as on Instagram at HostEnergy and Twitter at HostEnergyCast. All guests are sent the raw and completed audio the week of release. So far, no complaints. Be sure to leave us a positive review at iTunes. That gets the word out. Music was produced by Sean Stroop at Stroop Loops. That wraps up episode 180. Be sure to join us next week when we learn how one oil and gas company is making sure its clients are taking credit for the carbon they are curtailing. Until then, I'm Jay Downhauer. We'll see you next time.